Brenda, welcome on board.
Thank you so much, and I'm hopefully can give you a perhaps find a middle ground between my colleagues Sarush and Jason here. I'm very pleased to be talking to you about the ways in which we can look at generative AI from a social justice perspective, particularly supporting students with disabilities. As Jason has already kindly done, he's acknowledged the traditional territories. We do this in Canada because it's part of our act of truth and reconciliation with the First Peoples of our country. And you can see that was what it looked out my window yesterday. So not too bad Calgary weather in early October. I work in student accessibility services at the University of Calgary. So this is the kind of area that would be supporting students with disabilities with accommodations. And I also just like to highlight for everyone, when we think about disabilities, this is an area in which we are growingly recognizing a number of people. So in Canada, basically 1 in 4 will likely have a disability in their lifetime. So at any point, about 25% of the population has a disability of some kind. And we're recognizing now more and more of these are tied to invisible disabilities. So in our language, that would be anything from neurodivergence, which would have been traditionally ADHD, or autism spectrum disorder. This could be mental health conditions, such as anxiety, something that might be reflected in some of your classes, to learning disabilities, even things, even some sensory disabilities around hearing are things that we may not know a student has, but they may be coping and working with that. And that's where I come into the generative AI kind of sphere. And as a first point, I was hoping to also wake everyone up, if it would be possible in the chat to maybe share, what do you think of when someone says the word assistive technology? What comes to your mind? See that we talk about this, you've given me an idea of some things are we start with just a helping tool in general. We have some that is tied very much to a specific challenge. And I'm going to share one kind of idea of this, which is really to recognize that assistive technologies, we can talk about them in the scope of disability, but we all use assistive technologies in many different ways. It's just certain technologies are privileged as just being technologies, and other ones are labeled as assistive, often when they're considered problematic in some contexts. So I'll give you kind of an idea of this. Glasses. If you wear glasses, you are using an assistive technology to help you see. But we would never label that as a class. We would consider it normative. So often when we think about assistive technologies, we're really only labeling them as assistive because we're saying they're only appropriate for people in particular contexts. So when I think about, restrictions around generative AI and some of the possible uses of it, one of my concerns is if we make them all labeled assistive technologies, we're almost saying that these technologies are only useful or allowed for this population, rather than recognizing that there are lots of assistive technologies we let everyone use. And we wouldn't make those individuals have to do any kind of work to deem that that's appropriate. So that's part of the lens that I'm coming from here. And why I have my little bunny ears or quotation marks over assistive. And there's a very interesting kind of heritage of generative AI and what would have been traditionally called assistive technologies. And I love that they're in the chat already, because if we think about screen readers, those are the ones that, read text to you. We think about dictation programs, so being able to talk and have it typed out. When I first started my career in accessibility services, these were very expensive programs and very specialized. But now they are built into pretty well every operating system, particularly for English language speakers. I recognize there's a privilege when it comes to all of this natural language processing background where it's trained itself on English and it sometimes does things in English it can't do in other languages. But these are the foundations of the natural language processing tools that became generative AI. So I think it's important to recognize that, screen readers, dictation programs, the origins of generative AI are in tools that started as assistive technologies and now have just become normalized for a majority of society. I like to set that context a little bit because in some respects, we're coming back a little bit to recognizing how these tools are actually helping us include and support diverse learners. And in fact, most of our learners are going to be diverse in some way moving forward. But there's kind of a key change that happened when we moved away from screen readers, dictation software. And those ones were very much focused on addressing a sensory need or a physical challenge. So if I'm asking for the screen to be read, originally that was coming from the idea that I had difficulty seeing the screen and I would need that support. Dictation software often came out with that idea, right, of, well, I have some sort of challenge with my hand. And so a lot of the emphasis of those developments was to actually content preservation, keep the same content, keep it going and making sure it's accurate, right? So copying and pasting the same way. And if anyone who ever used something like Dragon Dictation 15 years ago, it was kind of comical sometimes what it came out with, but now it's much more improved. But when we think about generative AI, really what we're thinking about is dynamic information generation. So it is no longer focused on just preserving the content in its original format. It's looking at semantics and patterns and actually providing us dynamic information that's often pulled from the sources that we've either given to the tool or from the internet at large. So we don't have that same content preservation going on. But it also means generative AI can do things that might have been limited in the earlier technologies that were very much focused on that, just switching the modality. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some examples here, so it's a little bit more pragmatic here, about two common areas of invisible disability that generative AI supports individuals with. And we're going to talk a little bit about executive function, as well as two common learning disabilities. Why we're going to do this for a couple reasons is, one is these are really common things that post-secondary students are looking for support regarding. The other piece is they're invisible, so we won't know. That student may not know that they might not be disclosed in your class. You wouldn't look at them and be like, aha, that person has this. The other piece too I want to highlight in the framework that I've used for looking at generative AI is I'm looking at how can a student as an independent, self-directed learner use these technologies rather than us trying to customize the class to that particular learner. There's some really interesting research that talks about when we try to do personalized education, sometimes the way we create those algorithms or certain competencies that need to be built moving forward means that learners don't actually get access to the full curriculum. So I think that's important that they have access to the full curriculum as well as for them to be agents in their own education. So that's another piece of this framework here. If you are not familiar with executive function underpins most of the ways in which we learn. It includes our intention or inhibition networks. It includes working memory. That's where we use old and new information together. And also includes cognitive flexibility. If you are tired, if you have chronic pain, if you're stressed, your executive function drops. So while we have conditions that are associated with executive function challenges, such as ADHD, you may recognize that you might at some point if you have a young child and you're not sleeping anymore because they keep waking you up. Chances are these all impact your executive function on a regular basis too, which may be why sometimes we all benefit from things that help us with our attention and working memory. So we'll go into sustained attention. Sustained attention, one of the things that it helps with is when you work with generative AI, you're working, right? You are putting content in, you are asking prompts, you are clicking buttons. This helps with this interactivity. So if we think of a traditional journal article, which is very static, when you read, and I often joke, I'm like, how many times did you highlight the whole paragraph, student? Maybe you stopped paying attention. So the idea here is that it's giving them interactivity with what is, and that helps sustain the attention. It's also very good at chunking the content, which means even if I don't get you to summarize it, It can still like put headings in where headings didn't previously exist. It gives us sections. It's making us easier to go through the reading. In many ways, helping us monitor some of the strategies we normally say, like skim this, skim that. Usually we don't tell students to read a full journal article from start to finish. We can already see how generative AI can help us structure that. And then generative AI tools, when we think about like scheduling software and things like that, can actually help us identify how we're using our time and what is our most effective time. So there are ways in which there are a whole bunch of things in terms of scheduling software. Most of it comes out of like a project management billing sphere, but it can also still be helpful for anyone to recognize how long did I spend on that project? How long did that actually take me? Do I work better in the mornings or the evenings? And it will create customized schedules for students. And because everyone has seen ChatGPT, I do like to highlight there's a world beyond it. So one example of a tool that students can use is something called askyourpdf.com. It's a free tool, or at least you can use it so much for free, like everything, and allows you to upload a PDF or a specific article, and you can talk to it. So this is a quick screenshot here. It provides potential questions. Each of these link back to the document where it found it, so you can actually verify the information, and allow students to have that discussion back and forth with the reading. So it can create the summary, the outline, like many other tools, but the nice thing about this is its scope is just tied to what the student uploaded to it. And it claims to be much like Sarush's tool to be a constitutional AI, so that is not saving that information and using it for programming. So we can see here, this can be quite helpful for any of us, but in particular, students with any sustained attention challenges. Working memory. So working memory is, again, bringing that short-term and long-term information. We often see students, when they're struggling with working memory, big complex projects are quite challenging. So how do I break down those steps? So I see Sarush's example of some of those tools that he has around research. You see, it sort of took it there and it breaks it down and provides it in different ways, all help support students with working memory here. But that's one thing that all Gen AI tools are great at, is that you can provide them, hey, I need to do this. What would be some key steps? And what would they be going with? So a tool like Perplexity can be helpful in that way, because it even gives you links to resources on how to do it. It can help us create visual representations to help us relate connections and relationships. So in this case, I am not a very good artist by any means, but a tool like AutoDraw guesses what I'm trying to draw and will let me click. So I did a squiggle, it figured out I wanted a brain. Do you want a brain? Yes. And so I can actually visually graph out relationships using Gen AI to help with what may be my limitations in artistic ability. So again, it's not doing the thinking for me, but it's helping me represent these in different ways. And the other way it can be useful is just students have a dialogue based on their interests or experiences. So often there have been concerns in the STEM area sciences in Canada. There's things around like, why is physics always throwing a ball? Right, which relates to some people's experiences, but maybe you never threw a ball as a child, or you weren't into sports. So you're able to actually take a question that was tied to a ball, throwing a ball or baseball, and put it into something like a ChatGPT and say, can you give me this example using dance? Similarly, there are ways in statistics, there's a bias towards using card games, playing cards to explain statistics. But if you never grew up using playing cards or baseball, I love baseball analogies in statistics here, and you're all thinking, baseball, right? If you came from another context, so here I can say, okay, draft sample questions using cricket instead of baseball. And again, we're making it more tied to their experiences or interests and getting them to work through that content rather than trying to teach them statistics in baseball, which is probably not the learning outcome of the course. When we talk about learning disabilities, there are two that I think are most applicable here. And if anyone here is a psychologist or psychiatrist, I apologize. We've kind of moved away from these labels, but then it's like learning disorder in this area, and it's very long. But there are two that are tied to language processing, where generative AI can be quite helpful. The first one is dyslexia. That's around reading. So that's the disability where there are challenges around word recognition, decoding of the word, particularly using phonics. So it's tied again more to phonics-based languages and that processing. So those students will have likely had challenges with reading throughout, and they come to post-secondary, and they're likely to have maybe a smaller vocabulary, struggle more with learning new vocabulary that is tied to the terms of the course. Where many of us would have acquired that through, oh, look, it's through context. I learned what this word meant because it's got this before and after. These students do not innately pick it up that same way. And the other one is dysgraphia, but basically that's tied to written expression. So these are often students who struggle in the area of like spelling, grammar, but in particular syntax. So the order of words in the sentence. And this is where generative AI for our assistive technology providers here have found really helpful. And in particular, the number of students who have talked about using generative AI in terms of supporting their reading is pretty revolutionary for them. For one, there are ways in which font spacing and color contrast can make it easier for the decoding process. There's something called the dyslexic font, which does different weighting on the bottom of certain letters to make it easier for students who have trouble with P and Q, B and D, right? Those words that we all have trouble when sometimes shaping them, and we spell things wrong when we're younger. So it helps, just that can help them process it easier or having more space. One of the things that can be particularly helpful with tools such as like Glean is when they can actually embed definitions or images of keywords. So we can look at actually putting context in and be able to click for that definition rather than typing that word into Google, what does it mean? Or to have a visual representation. So when they're running across words that either they typically misread or words that are new, it makes it just that little bit easier for them. Similarly, many of these tools are great at looking at the most common words and creating a glossary. So if a textbook doesn't have a glossary, this makes it easier for the students to be able to go, okay, I'm not going to innately pick up this vocabulary in my field, but it's going to be key for later on, so I'm able to look at it. And just even by being able to, as one student once said, I just tell it to tell me more simply until I understand it. And so that iterative process of, I needed to use different vocabulary. Can you explain it to me in a different way? And then being able to go back to the original source in this retroactive way, making it easier for that decoding and processing. For dysgraphia, I think we need to recognize text prediction exists. It may have its flaws, but if you are having trouble with word retrieval or how to spell a word, so nice when it's already like, oh, you want consciousness. And I'm like, great, because there's so many S's and C's, and I sometimes forget the order. I'm able to hit tab and just reduce the overall cognitive load. The proofreading ability is much improved when we actually have natural language processing. Academic writing is complicated. We tend to use a lot of long noun phrases that actually are the subjects of our sentence. An old school word grammar check does not understand that. But these tools do. It can see how things are actually functioning in the syntactic structure, or it can understand when we make an error in word choice, but they seem really similar, or they structurally in terms of the letters are similar, but they're very different in meaning, which I love because I used to get a lot of students' papers where there was a difference between deficit and defecate, which is only a small letter, but very big in meaning. And these are the kind of things that these tools would pick up, whereas Word wouldn't. The other way, it can actually be integrated in their revision practice. So I think about the ways in which we could look at saying, hey, put your paper into ChatGPT or anything else and say, have it write a summary of your paper. Is that actually what you wrote? These are tools that help students actually think about reading their work rather than just handing it in. So my example here is Grammarly, which is kind of interesting as it was the opposite of previous presenter Jason. But Grammarly does provide a rationale for why it's asking you for different things and to select it. And there are variations on the kind of feedback that it does provide. So in this way, I'm thinking of Grammarly in terms of its features around spelling and syntax, maybe not conciseness and some of the other paid add-on tools. So that's a few food for thought. I have a couple concluding ideas, but I want to do a check-in because again, it's the end of the day. Any questions, concerns? I'm happy if you take the mic and chat with me. Do a check-in there, and if there's any, or you vehemently disagree with me, because me and Jason sometimes have some very interesting discussions.
Maybe I have one question. I was, as I was following your presentation, I was thinking, how can I incorporate all this into the practicality and the daily routine of the education activities that I engaged in? So I have students, I do have some lectures, some practical assignments. How is there any easy way how to be reflective of all that?
So, and I can share this afterwards. One piece I did with a colleague at the University of Calgary, Lorelei Anselmo, we did something where we just asked students to reflect. So if they use generative AI, we just added, like, tell me how you used it. And we use this idea of, you know, is it just to help you kind of do something, or was it more integrated? So from that perspective, if you're worried, like from a student assignment piece, you could just have them reflect. I think sometimes it's also just helpful to, like any metacognition, to just show them that, right? So if you have, if you're doing a lecture, sometimes, you know, even looking at, you know, here are the keywords of the lecture. So if you even put your own recording in and then said, here, I'm going to share the keywords that are auto-generated by this, if you're comfortable having it process your voice. Sometimes just anything like that can be kind of helpful because it's sort of you're learning with the students, and sometimes they are the most helpful. Something like the notebook piece, LMN, which comes from Google. If students share similar Google Docs, you could say, okay, everyone, we're going to do our notes in a shared Google Doc. Everyone could probably work with and say, now upload that into the notebook, and we're going to do some activities based on our shared note taking for my lecture. And that doesn't really require, hopefully, a ton of work. I try to be pragmatic in that way.
Okay.
In that way, it's hard right now as a student to navigate because you get some courses don't use it at all. The other ones use it all the time. I think here it's where it's helpful is to kind of give them a few ideas of tied to that AI literacy in this class. This is what I recommend going forward. And even as a native link speaker, I find Grammarly really helpful as well, Jess. Thanks for sharing that. I'll kind of go to some conclusions, and if we have time and energy, we can kind of keep going. This kind of highlights when people ask me, like, well, how do you know if they're ethically using it? Because I come from a communication studies background, all technology makes certain tasks easier than others. It's built in, right? But really what matters is the intentionality of the student. Are we trying to have them interact with this, or are they trying to just replace work? I think if you have a good interaction with any of these Gen AI tools where you're asking it questions, asking it to reformat things, I think there's learning going on, from my opinion. I see them using it to help them further their knowledge. This is different than write me my essay. Clunk. So I think it's important that we both recognize that these technologies will make some things easier and harder, but at the same time, they can help with that skill development rather than task completion. And in fact, I think being able to understand technology, what does it do well? What does it not do well? Where does it make mistakes? Is probably actually a key lifelong learning skill for our students, regardless of discipline. And so that's where I'm thinking we can actually, when we're bringing these into the class. So for example, I'm teaching a course on, it's more tied to learning strategies, but I'm making them go research, pick a generative AI tool. I said not ChatGPT. Play with it. Tell me what it's good at. Tell me what it's bad at. Tell me what advice you would give to another student if they wanted to use it. And even getting them to think about biases, which is one of my favorite things to do, is hack your generative AI. Because I'm concerned about representation of gender, disability, race. And sometimes you find out really interesting things about what was, oh, this is what it learned on. Oh, now I understand it better. The other thing that I like to highlight is, and I'm sharing the words of other people here, but ChatGPT has done a really good job of helping us find zombie assignments. In this way, there are assessment practices that we've done for a very long time that we've really just been trying to keep alive. They're on life support. We know they're not good. And ChatGPT just really helped us identify that they should have gone a long way. So part of my perspective in speaking to you here today is to recognize that, you know, I would not be speaking to you if we were 30 years ago. As a white woman with a disability, chances are we didn't have spelling and grammar check. I probably wouldn't have gotten a PhD. So many of the ways we assess and we assign our students have a privilege of certain abilities. And I love that generative AI shakes that up and actually asks us, you know, who is privileging? Who is being privileged in these contexts versus others? And I think that's a key piece. So if you have fear around generative AI, maybe it's a good question to ask ourselves. Why do we think of writing as an innately human skill? And I'll give one example and then I'll stop talking. But I think it's an important example because about a year ago, I was talking with a professor who was vehemently against generative AI. And one of the things they said, if they can't write, how will they think? Right? For that person, writing was like, that's how we think. That's how we refine our ideas. And it was very interesting when I said, oh, interesting. I imagine there were some ancient Greeks in classical Greece going, if they can't remember it and speak it orally, how will they learn? And I challenged him a little bit. I said, and what does that say about in Canada, like our First Nations who have an oral culture? Do they not think? So these are the really fun and interesting questions I think generative AI brings up to us, because I think it makes us ask, is this actually a skill that's needed to succeed? Right? If you're in economics, do you need to be able to quickly tell me what 2 times 4 plus 8 is? Or would a calculator be sufficient? Who has access to those skills? So who are we privileging in saying that these are the required skills that are needed in this subject matter? And also who is disadvantaged? And I think that will help us recognize the variety of abilities in all of our learners and maybe help us make some choices about a more inclusive education system. So even if we're not integrating generative AI, having those really deep and challenging conversations can be very interesting. So I worry about a time when we all go back to pen and paper exams and in class, because I wonder who is privileged is the person who can hold that pen and can sustain that, right? Or who is able to concentrate in a noisy classroom environment. And so that's where I come into the discussion. And I'm kind of interested, I'm going to stop the sharing to see, first of all, who's awake, because I know it's been a long day, and 2, to see what does everyone else think, because I always learn from others.
Before other people do, you've mentioned a couple of like inquiring, introspective assignments, like tell me what you used, what you learned. While acknowledging the importance of this, I also feel that, you know, it is an assignment and probably you may want to evaluate it, you know, in a certain way, maybe even grade it. What challenges does this bring? Because I was always a little bit afraid that I'm being overly subjective when I'm evaluating, people's experience and people's performance. If there wasn't a very strong rubric, and I was, the more I was engaged in teaching, the more I became cognizant of my biases towards people who are well spoken, for example, or who are shy and who I have to, constantly urge to talk more. And it seems to me that such assignments would be prone to that. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have them or you shouldn't be striking balance, but is there any way how to navigate these things?
The multiplicity there. So when I think about having a reflection in terms of like, how did you use the technology? I think that's a supplement, right? Like, I think you still have your objective assignment, but I think then you also say, okay, if you choose to use generative AI, how did you use it? And to articulate it, because it's very hard to put, like people say, put a citation in, but it's very hard to cite, especially if you've moved things around and repeated. So I think it's like, I used it to generate an outline. I used that because I didn't know where to start with this assignment. If they just put that at the bottom, or if they went, I'm not a native speaker of this language, so I asked this tool to identify areas that were not clear, and then I reviewed the responses. So just a little bit. It doesn't have to be too substantive, rather than sort of saying, oh, you didn't use it. And I'll see if I can quickly pull up what I'm thinking of as kind of that reflective supplement, because I think that also includes a rubric on how to market as well, to help also make it a little bit easier to kind of work with. But yeah, it works on the SAMR model of technology integration. So it looks at like, did you just substitute an action? Did you augment an action? Did you modify it? Or did you redefine what you did? But our hope in that one was just to give a free template too that you can just use for students to kind of think about what would be expected. So that way, if you don't want to redesign your whole assignment, because it's still a valuable learning activity, but you are worried about, are they just replacing it with generative AI? You can provide this as an option.
When you mentioned that those zombie assignments, which were there in your case?
I think asking students to summarize a reading now has really become a zombie assignment.
Yeah, okay.
What I like to, because like the computer can do it for them. So what I rather have them do is, I really like it when students can do some sort of visual representation or organization, because that's a limitation right now. To go there. The other thing I think that sometimes for a zombie assignment, I think is anything, it would have been before, but like you can Google it. If Google can tell me the answer, I can go, hey, device name, what is X? And that would still get full marks. Then I'm like, no. We have to recognize students are dealing with more information than they would have 40 years ago. Like just look at the research and the number of citations per journal article, right? Like they've gone up dramatically. So I think we have to recognize they're going to have new ways to deal with that.
There's one question from Jess.
Not found a really good database of tools. But that's where I'm actually hoping we can use the students collaboratively. Like, I think this is the nice piece of, depending on what area you are in, like, can they create a blog? Can they do some of this evaluation? And that's what I'm hoping that can come out of the course that I'm teaching in that assignment. Is I'm going to collaborate with our Student Success Center, and any student who feels like, oh, I'm really happy with what I did or want to, then we can publish it there for them. So I think it's a nice way of having the students start to create the database, and also then they can create the database in terms of some of the ethical uses. Because it changes so quickly. That's the other piece, is if we have the students take this on as part of classroom assignment or an opportunity to connect, they'll keep it alive a little bit longer, because I learn about a new tool every day. or the tool that was free 6 months ago now becomes behind a paywall. But I'm thinking that may be something as a collective too, especially within disciplines. That might be a nice offer there to be kind of constantly creating this. And then you know what the students are using too, which is my other favorite part.
Maybe one final question from me. It's a broad one, but you finished your presentation on the question of what are the skills that we will be using or we will need to teach the students. And I asked Jason already about this, but I wonder about your perspective, navigating this for a couple of years. Where do you see things going?
Where I see things going, and it's not my idea. I just can't remember the author's name, but he called it the writing synthesizer hypothesis. Came out a few years ago. And he compared generative AI to the change from having a synthesizer for a sound versus having to learn the instrument. Right? Because there was a point where if you wanted a violin sound, you needed to know how to play the violin. All of a sudden there. And what I liked about that was it didn't ruin music. It helped it evolve in a new and different way. So when I think about where we're going here, I look to things like, oh, let's look at bricolage. Let's look at, postmodern art. And so I see, maybe I won't need to know how to write that fundamental perfect sentence, but I'll need to know how to evaluate it. I'll need to know how to make sense of it, and I'll need to know how to put them together to create something. So maybe we don't need to know all of the same little foundational tools, but the evaluation, being able to evaluate what's coming out, that's going to shift dramatically. And I think that's a very interesting piece because we've gone from passively consuming a lot of information to now we have social media, right? We have user-generated content. The ability to evaluate and compare sources to tell if something is a legitimate knowledge and useful. That's where I think it's like, that's where we're going to need to go in all of our fields, because information's there, but we don't have that sifting mechanism.
But
so that's where.
Wouldn't the AI tools do that as well on a better level than average human?
I think it'll tell you what is most common, but I don't think it could evaluate it in the same way. Like, you're still going to have to do some digging to see, right? Because unless we start creating our own Gen AI tools, which is fascinating too. Like, do we have to create our own? Do we have to give it a body of work that we deem or data that is valid? Because right now it's just going on what was its natural language model? What was the data that it was trained on? So I find it fascinating to have conversations with ChatGPT about, tell me a story about a doctor, and just keep going, repeating, tell me another story. And then I look at the race and gender that it's applied of all the doctors. Then I do the same thing with nurses. And it's interesting to see that all the nurses pretty well, all traditional female names. You ask it Midjourney to generate, someone did this a while ago, images of transgendered individuals. And they said, why do they all have purple hair? So these are the things that I think we need to help the students in their use of it. It's not so much, did it write the sentence for you? It's, did it write the wrong information? Did you see the bias in the information on the data set it was trained on? And how do we shift that? So I love the ones where you upload your own body of information, because then it's a great example too for a student to use Notebook LMM and say, okay, I want you to put in like only, for example, Donald Trump related supporting articles, and then ask it questions about economic policy. And then you get a very interesting point of view. Then if you have another group of students say, okay, take all these articles from these sources and upload it. So I think that's where we need to go, as the fundamental skills to recognize how can this be manipulated and changed based on the model and the type of information it is. It's the same where if you were to ask ChatGPT to write something and say, okay, write it as if you're from this place. It's from Canada, all of a sudden it involves a lot of A's and Tim Hortons. And I'm like, that's not a Canadian accent, because it doesn't know a Canadian accent. It only knows, well, these are somewhere I found on the internet that these are the habits. So I think that's where it's interesting to teach the students those things. And sort of going back to like 1990s culture jamming. How do we jam Gen AI? Just reading, Petra left us a comment. I appreciate your comment here, because I think you highlighted less about what it brings us, but more about how it maybe helps us think or have a different perspective. To me, that's the fun part of generative AI, right? It's how does it change the way that we think, and maybe for I hope for positive ways. Yeah, and is there any other questions anyone has, or yourself?
Okay, I'm fine. Brenda, I think we are going to wrap up. Thank you very much. This was really fascinating. Thank you for your contribution to the workshop. I thank all the speakers. I thank Jess for taking the brunt of organizing this, and I thank GreenDeal-NET for supporting us. And I will be looking forward to seeing everybody somewhere around. Thank you very much.